Hello, I'm David Morris. Welcome back to Risk. I'm reading from my book, A New Era of Risk. And today, China. What's going on? The rise of China, which has been astonishing. Does this have to be a threat for the rest of the world, or does it simply generate a whole range of new risks, and can those risks be managed? Well, today I'm going to start reading from Chapter 3, which is on the China dilemma. There is no precedent in living memory for a power transition on the scale of rising China. Its emergence as the world's largest trading nation after 4 decades of economic reform and opening up, and the likelihood that it will surpass the United States as the world's largest economy in coming years, shifts economic power from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This giant state that was not part of world order construction in 1919 or 1945 or 1989 is now indicating that it wishes to play a lead role in building the next world order. China's rise has generated a new geopolitical dynamic, a transition from the unipolar world since the end of the Cold War to a new bipolar, or perhaps more likely multipolar world, as India and other developing countries are also emerging with new power in the international system. In China, a new narrative, a new discourse of nationalist confidence has taken hold, mirrored by a discourse of anxiety in the US and its allies. A new order is nevertheless yet to take shape, and China's role in any new balance of power remains axiomatically uncertain. China's vast networks of geo-economic interdependence across the developing world under the banner of the Belt and Road generate new risks as well as new opportunities, and significant uncertainty about the shape of new trade routes, economic corridors, and transforming global and regional value chains. China's growing geoeconomic power has made it globally consequential and potentially game-changing. Geoeconomic power is commonly understood to refer to the use of economic and financial power for geopolitical purposes, as well as its deep integration with the advanced economies through global value chains. China has become a major financier, investor, and aid donor in the developing world. That developing world, including China, is now moving from the margins to play a central role in international relations and the international economy, and brings to the international system new priorities and new goals. Indeed, globalization has empowered multiple new actors, particularly in Asia, and it has demonstrated the relatively declining role of the traditional so-called Western powers that dominated earlier stages of internationalization. So this explains one of the fundamental changes that's underway, and it's one that is very interesting to look at through, with an attempt at least, to look through eyes that are not biased, or not looking at things through only the interests of one culture or one nation. If we step back and look at the globe and what's happened in recent decades, there's been this vast shift to greater equality, the rise of the developing world, the rise of hundreds of millions of people out of poverty into the international economy has been a great thing from the perspective of global equality. Of course, it hasn't necessarily been a great thing from the perspective of perhaps some people in the United States and Europe, which feel like that success of the developing world has come at a cost to them. So this, I think, is part of the dilemma. So risks as well as opportunities abound in such an evolving order of uncertainty, particularly because of the complex interdependence of the global economy and the simultaneous geopolitical contest that is emerging. So this chapter that I'm starting to read from today seeks to understand those risks and opportunities generated for a diversity of actors, not just one side or the other, who've become interdependent with China, and in the context of a world order that's in a period of great uncertainty and disruption. In the new unfolding global power realignment, China has become a leading player in the institutions of the international order, such as the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, etc. It participates, although it's constrained by limited voting power, in the Bretton Woods multilateral development banks, the IMF, the World Bank. China is also innovating. It's deploying its new economic power to build new institutions and quasi-institutions with potentially global reach, many of those in the economic sphere absorbed under the umbrella slogan of the Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road in Chinese, which is an ambitious bid to reshape supply chains and drive development centred on Chinese finance and Chinese industrial capabilities. Whether these new initiatives complement or challenge the liberal international order, which we're used to talking about in the West, is a matter of vigorous debate. In recent years, the US has dramatically switched its China strategy from engagement to strategic competition, claiming China's rise poses security threats in its challenge to US global power. Whether China's rise demands the rest of the world abandon economic interdependence and characterise each interaction with China as a security threat, however, remains in question. To be sure, China has a dramatically different political, economic and social model from the advanced economies and has different priorities for the international system. Equally, the dramatic shift of US strategy in the Trump era and the Biden era too have created new uncertainties about the future of global economic interdependence. China's reform and opening up, this process of marketisation that began in 1979 or late 1978 in China and has transformed China. This what the Chinese call reform and opening up began as a result of new policy that was adopted by the ruling Communist Party, as I said, in late 1978. It introduced market mechanisms, including allowing the emergence of a private sector and pursuit of export-focused and capital investment-driven growth. China developed its own version of the East Asian development model. We'll talk more about that later, but really what China did was a version of what Japan and South Korea and Singapore and other places in East Asia did as well. Now, China's different, and we'll come to those differences, but there are some commonalities as well. Utilising interventionist industry planning while engaging with the global economy, going further than Japan in opening its economy for foreign investment, but retaining a greater degree of direct state control over critical sectors of the economy. While the party states' 5-year plans continue to provide overall policy direction, the private sector has continued to grow and to now rival the state-owned sector. Although in recent years, under the strengthening leadership of Xi Jinping, the party state has been retightening its control in a bid to prevent large private enterprises from amassing the kind of power that their equivalents wield in the US, especially in finance and in technology. By re-establishing more central control, Xi is widely considered to be confirming the long-held maxim that the future stability of the Communist Party's rule is based upon continued competent and technocratic governance that can deliver sustainable growth, economic and social transition towards a higher income economy and more widely spread benefits to Chinese society. Now, whether the party state can do so, in particular whether it can bridge the middle income trap that has plagued many other developing countries at this stage of development that China's reaching at the moment, and whether China can succeed in shifting to more advanced forms of investment and consumption while remaining politically authoritarian remains uncertain. A post-COVID-19 structural shift to lower rates of growth is shaking domestic and international confidence. These are not just domestic questions for China. Because of China's size, its challenges are necessarily also challenges for the international system itself. Elite and popular opinion within China itself tends to represent the nation as a stabilising, peaceful stakeholder in the international system. China's grand initiatives to build economic connectivity are therefore positioned as a benign contribution to global governance now that China has become the second largest economy and has a large stock of investment capital and development expertise. Nevertheless, The prevailing realism, authoritarianism, and deep economic and social reach of its party state represent a formidable consolidation of power, providing an asymmetric advantage if and when that power is deployed against the interests of others in the international system. Indeed, as we shall see, China's growing capabilities raise questions about how it will exercise such power in future, both in pursuit of its economic interests and over time as a major power. As Xi often asserts, the world is undergoing profound changes unseen in a century. This is a phrase he often uses, and I think it's quite an accurate one. The shift in the global power balance underway has begun to elicit diverse reactions. Across much of the developing world, China's economic transformation is widely admired. Indeed, even in much of the advanced world, it is recognised that the consequence of China's reform period, the movement of hundreds of millions out of poverty and the development of Asia's largest middle class, constitute one of the greatest welfare transitions of human history. Only a very Atlantic-centred perspective on world history could see it otherwise. Elites in countries facing development challenges have increasingly looked to China for lessons and for assistance. China's rise has therefore come to represent in some respects the aspirations of the developing world for a greater share of prosperity and a more proportionate influence in the world, even as many within historic rival nations such as India, Japan or Vietnam simultaneously fear how China will wield its growing power. In Asia, leaders who have emerged in countries that were themselves authoritarian until they reached a high level of development demonstrate caution to protect their national interests, but they exhibit less of a normative distaste for the Chinese political system than their Western counterparts. Indeed, after a history of conflict in the Cold War and the long experience of colonialism, Asian leaders tend to prefer multipolarity to hegemony by one power. Given the cultural diversity of Asia, leaders there also tend to exhibit a greater level of ease with complexity and contradictions than the more absolutist worldviews of the West, with Asian governments relatively more comfortable to build economic interdependence with China and at the same time to hedge and balance against Chinese power. This presents a central question for China political risk analysis, whether it is possible to do both. So just in conclusion on that point about how Asian leaders, Asian elites, and actually leaders and elites across the developing world look at China, I think this is an important thing for us, especially those of us from the West, to comprehend that there is a diversity of reactions to China. And so there are voices, significant voices across the developing world looking with some level of admiration at the Chinese model, not necessarily wanting to copy China itself, but wanting to copy China's successful development. And so this leads to a very different dynamic, actually, in the developing world from the way the West is responding to the rise of China. So that brings me to the second part of this introductory comment about the rise of China. In the West, that small proportion of the world's population that has dominated the international economy and disproportionately benefited from industrialization until the development surge of recent decades, the reaction to China's growth has been distinctly different from that of the developing world. The US and its closest allies have none of the Asian tolerance for multipolarity. So long as China displayed little inclination to act as a major power, an optimistic consensus prevailed, expecting that China could be accommodated in the liberal international order. That optimism and commitment to constructive engagement began to dissipate as China, under the strengthening leadership of Xi Jinping, exercised more assertive actions in the South China Sea, became a dominant investor and financier in the developing world, and aspired to lead the world in the rollout of new technologies. All of these more ambitious moves by China in the recent years followed the worst financial crises in the US and Europe since the Great Depression, and a dramatic new polarisation of domestic politics in those countries. Distracted by their own economic and political crises, leaders in the US and in the EU had paid relatively little attention to China's rise until Donald Trump channeled populist anger against China in his 2016 election campaign. Fueled by debt, the US had been running significant trade deficits with China, an unbalanced relationship that economists had long warned was unsustainable. At the same time, US security focus had been elsewhere. Despite President Barack Obama's pivot to Asia, the US military had been bogged down in long, seemingly unwinnable wars in the Middle East. Meanwhile, China continued to build its own defence capabilities to become the second-ranked military power, although still well behind the US in force projection capabilities. The US response to the new balance began in geo-economic terms, but quickly became a matter of national security, and then a cultural battle of fear and blame. Trump first initiated a trade war, then declared China a strategic competitor, and in characteristic populist style seized upon the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 to whip up fear and blame of China. Popular approval of China plummeted in the West at that time. Further, the US, by the time of Trump, appeared to have lost confidence in the international system that it had led in the post-war era, withdrawing from several international organisations, including most famously the World Health Organization at the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, and signalling a rethink about globalisation that advocated a binary decoupling from China and its global value chains, in particular in the technology that was driving the current economic transformation to a connected Internet of Things. President Joe Biden, who served between the two Trump presidencies, escalated the trade war with China. He didn't diminish it, he escalated it, although his administration also sought to stabilise military-to-military communications and cooperation in areas such as climate change. But the culture of fear and blame continued to firmly frame the Western discourse about China, with risks commonly catastrophised as threats, and a binary winner-takes-all geopolitical approach favoured, in which strength was measured in the popular narratives by each country's degree of resistance to China, rather than constructive engagement through geo-economic interdependence and geopolitical balancing. China's significant geo-economic power is considered to give it new influence, which is normatively feared as generating a new network of new dependencies that China may leverage in future to overturn the global balance. Its domestic political system, which features deeply embedded authoritarianism to stifle dissent, particularly in the troublesome border regions, has become a new focus of Western disapproval. This generates an array of political risks for international businesses partnering with or invested in China. The discussion that will follow will look at the risks of interdependence with China even beyond China's borders. One overarching initiative of Xi's China is widely perceived to cross between geoeconomic innovation and geopolitical grand strategy, and that is, of course, I've mentioned it before, the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI. The BRI and China's associated finance, investment and aid have become increasingly caught up in these narratives of China's rise, global interdependence and the subsequent opportunities, risks or threats, depending on the vantage point of the observer. Now, what is the Belt and Road Initiative? Well, the BRI is an umbrella term for China's ambitious bid to create new institutions, new infrastructure and economic connectivity across the developing world and beyond. As a key framework for China's aspiration to lead the next phase of globalisation, the BRI is pitched primarily at the developing world, where the BRI has been taken up with enthusiasm, but it is also open to participation by the advanced economies. The initiative, in its commonly understood scope, includes new institutions as well as a broader set of agreements and platforms to build new infrastructure and economic connectivity across the developing world, connecting back to China as the hub and linking new value chains to advanced markets. In characteristic Chinese fashion, grand plans are announced, earnest promises made, and projects implemented with massive deployment of Chinese capital, expertise and labour, sometimes successfully, but sometimes bulldozing over localised opposition and generating or facing a plethora of other problems, some of which are local problems, and we'll explore many of that as we continue to read through. In international relations and security, China's growing economic power in the developing world, represented by the Belt and Road, generates critical questions and risks in relation to global order, international finance, technology, and infrastructure. The inherent complexity and structural change occurring in the international system axiomatically mean that there are indeed multidimensional risks for multiple actors, just as there are likely to be opportunities. If the geopolitical contest deteriorates into confrontation and conflict, there will also be threats, real threats to actors, whether businesses or whether nations. Now, often the term influence is used in the popular narratives without any definition, and so I prefer to use the term power, which I think is a bit clearer. In this discussion below that we'll continue with, power is understood to represent one actor's capacity to influence another actor to take an action that it would not otherwise take. So power can manifest as hard power, which is coercion or economic purchase, if you like, soft power, which is attraction and persuasion, or even smart power, which is the ability to set the agenda. And Joseph Nye famously defines those different kinds of power. On most measures, China's power in the international system is observed to be growing, resulting in a relative decline in US power, but only relative. Although it is unclear whether contemporary perspectives are clouded by recent US domestic dysfunction, or indeed what appeared until recently to be unstoppable Chinese growth, both of which may indeed play out differently in the future than in the past. Particular Western fears are provoked by China's new soft power in its development of new norms for financing for development, China's new smart power in agenda setting as a new world order emerges, and China's hard power in funding, constructing and controlling strategic potential dual-use infrastructure. In much of the geopolitical literature and the prevailing Western narratives, Chinese finance, technology and infrastructure connectivity are now catastrophized at each point of interdependence as generating national security threats. The new discourse is driven by assumptions of inevitable confrontation or conflict and a deep distrust that China will destabilise the global balance of power. From the opposing vantage point, Chinese observers believe the current global power balance could do with some rebalancing, and the Western fears are contested and debated in an emerging literature of scholarly work and government claims as well, and of course business views as well, all of which I've engaged with in interviewing for this book. Nevertheless, populist, intuitive reactions to China's rise dominate the Western narratives, reinforcing ideological binaries. In this climate, this discussion that I'm having here in reading my book seeks to step back from those binaries and to understand how international actors seek to maximise their gains and minimise their vulnerabilities in the world, how it is and how it's likely to be, rather than how we might wish it to be. I'll leave it there, but we've got much more to say about the rise of China and the risks and the opportunities generated. See you next time.